Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.
Sensemakers.
So today on the Sensemakers podcast, we have something a little bit different. Normally on this show, we talk to data analysts and try to talk about subjects that are related to the day-to-day business of reporting and just making sense of data. But from time to time, we talk to different experts in the field, people who are leaders in various companies, whether they be startups or established companies, people at executive levels, things like that, to learn something a little bit different. And we call that our data in chief type of series. And so today we have the Chief Executive Officer of Prediction Guard, who is Daniel Whitenack. And Dan, is it all right if I call you Data Dan? I think you've gone by that moniker before. How's that?
That's fine. In the first startup I was at, there was another Dan, and he was in DevOps. So basically, everyone was either said, that's DevOps Dan, that's Data Dan. So it's kind of stuck since then.
That's great. Yeah, well, that's definitely the kind of people that we're talking to today, is people that deal with data. Now, you've been in the space of AI for a lot longer than I think most of us have even been aware of the hype cycle. You've been hosting the Practical AI podcast. You've got your PhD in the subject. You've seen this and worked with it for a long, long time from a very practical standpoint, right? And so I'm dying to know that, given that length of experience and that breadth of experience, how are you seeing people actually use this thing that we're all talking about? Like, just from the standpoint of the person who's just working with trying to build reports based on data every single day, how are they actually practically using this thing that until very recently seemed like it was the domain of high-level experts and deep data scientists? Now that I can use it as someone who is a business intelligence kind of person, what are people actually doing out there?
Yeah. I think that there's maybe a couple of relevant categories here, which I kind of distinguish in my mind. One is the side of your personal use of the technology and your day-to-day activities as a practitioner. So, not personal use as in kind of not related to work, but personal as in, hey, I'm coding, or I'm writing this SQL query, or I'm doing this task or creating this report as a practitioner. How am I using these tools? And the second would be actual product, or it could be internal or external product usage of the technology, which is, hey, my customers often come to us and ask for reports for this or that. I wonder if I could generate those or have them, tie that into our product. So if we distinguish those, kind of the more like enterprise or productized versions of this and the personal use, I think that's helpful, because different things are useful. So on the product side, I think what a lot of people are finding is that there's still a lot of engineering that's needed here. It's true that, for example, you can have an AI system that generates SQL queries for you based on natural language and get results to your users. So this is what I kind of call the dashboard killer type of application, if you will, where instead of trying to create a dashboard and anticipate people's needs, you want your customer to ask in natural language, hey, how many work orders did we have at this facility last month compared to the same month last year, right? Obviously, that maps very well into a SQL query. The idea of this type of system is you would generate the SQL query with the AI model, execute it in good old-fashioned code, and then present the results in some way to the user. So within that type of system, on the inner kind of productized side of it, there is still a lot of engineering that's required. There's sort of I think people get disillusioned because they'll buy like a product that says, we'll do all your text to SQL for you, plug in your database and get all the reports you want. And it just sort of doesn't work. And that's because there is a lot of domain knowledge, schema information, et cetera, that needs to be embedded in that system. There needs to be kind of fine tuning of the pipeline that's producing those results. And so there's engineering that's needed in that type of system. On the other side, the personal use side, you can use kind of pre-built tools to do a lot of things that are more interactive. So on the product side, you don't really want your user to necessarily have to ask like 17 questions to get a good answer. On the personal side, it's okay for me to go back and forth with a chat assistant to figure out like how to debug this Python code, and that's okay, and it can still be efficient. So I think it really depends on kind of which portion you're talking about, the productized side or the personal side. But I would say that yes, like on the personal usage side, everyone should be exploring these things in one form or another and figuring out what works for them. On the product side, you really have to hone in on the engineering that's necessary to productize that type of behavior or system.
So that's very interesting. And as an analyst, one of the things that I hear is something that I heard many years ago when it became easier and easier for people to create their own dashboards. I heard terms like Wild Wild West and the democratization of data, and anybody can do anything that they want. How do we know that they're doing the right things? How do we keep some control over that whole process? And I think that's very important also when it comes to kind of the security mindset. So your current company is called Prediction Guard, and that's very heavily focused on AI security. And one of the things that I heard you say in the conference that we both recently attended, the Missional AI conference, which you've had a very key role in organizing over the past many years, very informative for me. And a comment that you made, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that if you don't give people a safe place to use AI and do these things with the AI tools that people are just clamoring for, then they're still going to use it just in ways that you don't know about.
Yes.
And it harkens back to this concept of like shadow IT and things like that. Can you expand on that a little bit and just talk about your overarching philosophy of AI security and controls as we talk about, let's open up the box and let people use AI for all their analysis? That worries some people.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts and philosophy on that?
Yeah. This is a great point. I think that any company, everyone in that company now is aware that there are tools that will help them be more productive. And I think generally, if we give people the benefit of the doubt, people in their job want to do their job well. They might want to be efficient at various things. They want to have tools that will help them do a better job. And so, yeah, I think there are companies that, for example, don't want their developers to generate code with code assistance, right? Because of maybe they're not sure about, the copyright issues associated with that, or the code repositories that will be shared to third parties and that sort of thing. But all these developers recognize I can do things much faster if I plug in, these code assistants into my editors. And so it definitely will happen. And people, of course, paste spreadsheets or whatever it is into chat assistants to get help with things. So I think it is relevant that every company needs to consider the types of data that they deal with and develop a kind of new intuition for people, similar to how maybe it's not quite the same, but with email, right? To some degree, we sort of have to train people to say like, hey, this is really not something you should send via email. This is not something that that is appropriate for that mechanism, you kind of have to train this intuition again. And people are still going to use email, right? So I think there's a little bit of a training opportunity there. I think from that perspective, on the personal use side, to some degree, that has to be driven by key leaders in an organization. So a team lead needs to be using these tools, and when they have one-on-ones with their direct reports, right, they're pulling up the tools, showing, hey, we were talking about this, I'm going to try this in this tool, and show them how they're using it, maybe when it's appropriate, when certain data is not appropriate to have there. However, I think that can only go so far, which is why, a lot of what we're doing at Prediction Guard is really bringing secure AI systems into a company's infrastructure. Because if you're reliant totally on third-party tooling, where everything that goes through it goes to another AI provider, it will be stored somewhere else. Whether they treat it according to their terms or not, it could be breached, it could have problems. So by bringing the AI system into your own infrastructure and then running whatever it is, chatbots, code assistants, product features off of that system that's inside of your firewall, it just reduces the risk of data leakage and that sort of thing. It doesn't solve all the problems, and I can talk about those things too. There's still certain things and best practices you need to take care of, but it does solve a lot of those issues of sort of data siphoning off, IP, data leakage, et cetera.
Yeah. So this is an interesting concept, and I really wanted to ask more about what it is that you're doing at Prediction Guard and how that whole process works to take these, advanced, nifty, cool, hype-inducing things that we all are just clamoring to use and love using, and just really wish we could use that on our internal data warehouses and the
Right.
spreadsheets that we've got everywhere. But like you said, it's not a good idea to just send that out to something that, is going to store it somewhere outside of the company. That's a huge risk. At the same time, like, okay, it sounds wonderful that we can bring that in-house and run it on our own infrastructure, but it's still, from a business analyst standpoint, it's still kind of unfamiliar enough that it's like, that sounds a little scary. What kind of infrastructure am I going to need? Do I have the experts in-house that can even build that and run that? Because this is still very, very cutting edge stuff. Am I going to find the people that can help me sustain that? Or is it just too complicated? Like, what's your experience and how that ends up working? Like it sounds great.
Yes.
But what's the cost and what's the difficulty?
Yeah. I think that it's a good place that we're in the industry right now, because a lot of the work that has caused AI to proliferate has also created a lot of really good tooling at the infrastructure and kind of serving layer of these models, and also allowed us to have flexibility over both, you know, maybe more expensive GPU type hardware and less expensive hardware, and allowed us also to have flexibility between on-prem, hybrid, and cloud VPC type of environments. So at least the customers that we would typically interact with, they're already running some type of software somewhere. So I guess that would be one distinction. If you have stuff running in AWS or Azure or somewhere, you're probably used to spinning up some type of services, some type of APIs, some type of software in your environment. And I would just think of this workload as another workload that is a kind of self-hosted software that you can bring into that environment. And thankfully, whether it's us or others, Prediction Guard has created a lot of automation around that, whether you're deploying in an air-gapped environment with a zero dependency binary and you just drop it in that environment, or you're in, Azure or AWS or somewhere, and you could deploy kind of directly from the cloud console and then manage everything else from an admin panel, just like drag and drop. I want to add this model. I want to provision this API key. I want to, monitor this thing for this model. All of that's kind of doable from that admin side. And that really allows then, I kind of mentioned earlier, this engineering that has to happen at the application level. So really our goal is to say, well, you all know the domain of your data, you know your systems, you know your schema, you know what your users are going to ask. That all is essential to build at that kind of like application level. But you don't necessarily worry about how to horizontally scale out an LLM across nodes in your infrastructure. That can be taken care of. That's a known thing that can be built and kind of brought in. And so often what we see, the way that we've balanced this is we've really focused at that infrastructure level and said, hey, here's an easy way to basically get all the AI building blocks in a secure environment. And then what we do is we kind of provide what we call, starter kits or templates. And one of those is a text to SQL, starter kit. One's a, RAG, a retrieval augmented generation starter kit. But in the text to SQL case, we know you're going to have to modify that because your scenario is unique. Like your data is unique, your database is unique, but hopefully that gets you 80 to 90% of the way there. And then you can modify the template accordingly to get you to that kind of 100% mark.
Okay, so it sounds like you're making it easy for those people like me who are thinking, I'm still learning how to most effectively even use an LLM.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of setting one up for myself is just not going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And yet, corporately, IT wise, we do want to keep it inside a walled garden, inside that firewall. Yeah. And still take advantage of just all the wonderful things that are possible now.
Yeah.
That's an interesting approach.
And it might be like an analogy might be if you think about a CRM or an ERP type of system, are you going to build a CRM or an ERP from scratch? No one should do that, right? There's people that have built those systems, let them build it. You can bring it into your own environment and then have a CRM or ERP. But once you bring that in, there's still a lot of customization that has to happen for your business on top of those systems, right? And so that's kind of, if you want to think about a parallel, we're providing that kind of foundational layer of what you need to run the AI things that you're running, whether those be kind of custom code, low code, no code tools, chat interfaces, whatever that is. And then when you bring that into your environment, then yes, you will need to do things at the application level that fit your business use case. But you're not building from the kind of lowest layer up. You're building just at that application level and customizing accordingly.
So I'm still very curious to learn about just the practical use cases, right? Your podcast is Practical AI. Mm-hmm. Like I said, you've been talking about this stuff since long before LLM was even a household acronym, right?
Master of law.
Right. And, I really appreciate the practical applications of things in an everyday sort of a context. So I'm curious, given that experience, given the things that you've talked about and talked to many other people on your show about, what are you learning as far as how people are actually using these kinds of technology for specifically data analysis? You talked about text to SQL. We're hearing some things about, automated dashboard generation, automated chart generation, things like that. And there's still some trust issues. There's still some talk about the engineering required for like a semantic layer.
Yeah.
Right. And I very much appreciate your emphasis earlier about how, look, this still takes some engineering effort.
Yes.
Right. What are you seeing out there in terms of just adoption and application when it comes to everyday analytics and just business level reporting?
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you split this into a few categories, you kind of have what I would consider natural language analytics, meaning there's a natural language question that comes in that's an analytics question, and you want to either generate, the data to answer that question, or provide the data to the user, or provide a visual and or provide a visualization. There's then, I think, another side of this, which is really what, you know, I lived also through the big data days, right? It's often what I would consider like the data pipelining sort of thing. So I drop a file in this SharePoint folder. I then want to take that file, read it in, OCR it, extract this information, check it against this source or validate it, and then pop it into a database, right? Whatever that sort of might be. You could think of any number of data pipelines that are kind of like that. So a kind
Right.
of natural language analytics, which is really driven off of this text to SQL. There's kind of data pipelining, which is more of this flow building. There's a trigger, whether that's a file dropped in a certain place or a user query or whatever that is, that then kind of executes a data pipeline in the background. And then I think there's kind of a more general thing that we've seen around maybe what I'll call batch data enhancement or understanding. So pretty much everyone has a big old pile of files somewhere that has accumulated over time, and you don't really know what's in there. Maybe there's duplicates. You don't have it fully labeled in terms of metadata and that sort of thing. So we had one customer that had hundreds of thousands of HVAC manuals, right? Are any of these duplicates? How many, of these do we have of this? What version of this equipment does this manual correspond to? And so that kind of batch processing of all of those things is something that can be quite efficient with this set of tooling. So that's what I would say, like real-time analytics on that natural language interface, the kind of general data pipelining, which might be triggered by a file going somewhere or something coming off of a queue or user query. And then this kind of batch enhancement or data manipulation. Those are the things that I see very frequently. And I should emphasize, from the practical standpoint, some of what you kind of alluded to is very true, in the sense that I think a lot of people, when they think about data analysis, almost think about code generation. So, like, I'm going to generate a dashboard, right? They might think, well, the user is going to put in a request, and then I'm going to generate the code that generates a dashboard and then execute that code. That has all sorts of problems, not the least of which is that most of the time the code doesn't run, which is problematic. Often what we see, again, this gets back to the engineering point, is if you can generate SQL queries, you have existing SQL tooling to validate those, to run cost estimates, to optimize SQL queries, to connect to role-based access controls, right? All of those sorts of things that are well controlled. Also, if you're generating visualizations, it's much easier for you to have pre-written code for a bar chart and for a line graph and for a scatter plot or whatever it is, and then use the LLM to determine maybe which visualization you're going to use, but then just use the pre-written code to generate the visualization. Much, much more reliable. And so this is where people, maybe I'm disappointing some people because they thought it would be easier. Like, you still need that element of writing code. You need those modules that LLMs can call, or that can trigger to be called. But certainly there's amazing possibilities, especially on the text to SQL side. We have a customer that has 1,600 tables in their database, lots of user defined fields. They have this text to SQL and report generation kind of tool on top of that. And it's taken a lot of work for them to hone that system in, right? It's not just like right out of the bat, you can query everything. But now that they have, the amount of value they're getting out of that is massive.
So it's still very new. There's still a lot of effort involved in defining some of those backends. And I would even argue on the text to SQL side, like there's still a lot of effort necessary to define agreed upon business logic and
Mm-hmm.
exceptions to, what to put in the where clause
Yeah.
and how to calculate this thing. Those things need to be baked into the model and the knowledge that might be generating that SQL. So it's still early days, but there's a lot of promises ahead. What kinds of things do you look forward to us being able to do in the near future within companies that might have very secure data,
Mm-hmm.
very large databases, and want to make more use of the things that we're all excited about? What do you think is coming next?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the trend that I'm seeing anyway is that there are each organization will create sort of individual, rigid workflows that provide value, but they're sort of rigid in the sense that here's my tool that converts natural language to queries against my analytics database, and it does this thing, and then they build maybe another tool that's an automation or something like that. I think then you start to imagine certain workflows that can operate on top of those or almost treat those AI systems that you've built as tools in and of themselves. So just to give an example, we have that customer that I mentioned that has the 1600 tables, text to SQL. They have an interface to their database, right? Which in their case is a manufacturing database. They also have built kind of an interface to their software documentation and policies and onboarding materials and training information, right? And so when you think about combining those two things, then you can do very interesting things now with both of those tools, right? So your software documentation can actually inform your queries, and your queries might help point to certain things that need to be resolved or alerts that need to be happen with summaries that can be generated out of your software documentation. So, oh, here's an agent that runs in the background that has queried this information as abnormal, and has pulled relevant documentation related to similar customer issues in the past. And so that way, when a support person sees it, they see not only the issue potentially that's popping up, but the data is already pulled, some statistics are there, and kind of a dossier is written about like this type of issue and that sort of thing. So just to give an example, I think that higher level of orchestration and multi-tool things is kind of where things are headed. I'm not at this point the kind of agents, quote unquote, is a loaded term. I think even what I just talked about there, it's a very simple routing, which happens, without a lot of iteration and open-endedness, right? So that's, I think, what's working well now. Where people get kind of burned on the agent front is this sort of open-ended agent that's like, I'm going to make generate a plan of how to solve a problem, and then I'm going to execute that plan, and then I'm going to determine if I've executed the plan, and then if I haven't, then I'm going to generate another plan, and then I'm going to execute that plan, and then circle around, and that usually kind of also ends in a good amount of pain.
So it sounds like that this thing that you're describing is something that is a near-term potential that you're looking forward to, or kind of expecting to come about. Is something that I'm also looking forward to, which is the ability for these models and these tools to look at not just one system like our data warehouse or our data lake with very structured data, but also our documentation, also things that we can get from just the World Wide Web, and these open source models, and kind of combine and collect all of that knowledge, structured, unstructured, natural language, data oriented, put them together in such a way that our processes are informed by so much more than just a narrow window or a single system. So I think that's a really huge potential.
Yeah, I would agree. I do think that there's some human workflow related things that we'll need to navigate as part of that. I don't know if you or your listeners have tried any of the kind of vibe coding sort of things. You could almost think about some of what we're talking about as things that are almost prompt driven analytics or reporting sort of things that might take some time to run, and it's almost like a vibe analytics sort of role. And I found myself with these sorts of tools kind of having to learn a new way of working that isn't always it isn't always straightforward how that works out. Like I can have a vibe coding tool over here generating code, and then I go to my email because that's working. I have to context switch, and then I context switch back, right? And my vibe coding tool wasn't working, and now I've context switched, so I have to remind myself, and then I get it going again. And the mental load with kind of working with these types of assistants can be challenging. And so I think we'll have to do a bit of learning around that and see what works within our own kind of, as an analytics practitioner, what is our way of working? How does that change? How do we kind of create those kind of new best practices, et cetera?
Yeah, it's clear that there's a lot of new territory to explore. And I think as we get into new territory that people aren't really sure how it's going to work and how we're going to keep it secure. There's a lot more to talk about and a lot more to learn. So I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that. And I'm very interested to hear more about how the things that you're doing with your company, Prediction Guard, is trying to make it simpler for people to enable these new tools, but still do it in a way that is secure, but also not such a big hurdle that it's just impossible to build something within their own company. So these are exciting times.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me share a little bit about that. Really appreciate the practicality of this conversation and you getting to some of those points. There's more of that that's needed out there. So
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dan. Hope to hear more from you in the future. And for people who love listening to the Sensemakers, I can highly recommend Dan's podcast as well, Practical AI.
Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.